right. So, Titus, thank you so much for joining us for Superbio Scientist Spotlight. Um, Per tradition, why don't you start off by telling the Superbio community about yourself?
Okay. Yeah, it's great to be here. I appreciate the invite. I have had quite the eclectic career where I've collected a lot of really interesting friends as well. So Ava is an example of that, where Ava and I connected, I don't know, a year or two ago, as I was saying snarky things on the internet, and she was like, "Hey, that sounds fun. Let's do that." So I'm currently an academic, but kind of going way back. I was pre-med in college, took my first computer science class my last semester of college, and fell in love, realized didn't want to do medicine. And I was broke and I had never had a job because I was always going to go to med school. So I didn't bother doing internships or anything. So I picked up, moved to Silicon Valley and started tutoring. Couldn't get a job as a biologist in the Bay Area back in the day. Um, and so I, by happenstance, was tutoring for someone. She recommended me for an internship at Box and the business development team. Box, the cloud storage company. Never had a job, didn't know anything about business, and they were like, "Yeah, hard pass." And so as I was walking out, though, the recruiting team was like, "Hey, we got a job. You want to come be a sorcerer?" And I was like, "I've always wanted to be a sorcerer. Let's do that." So I thought I was going to be a wizard and all that jazz, but no, it was fun. But really, I'm much better at not working than I am at working. And so I took my first year off by buying a one-way ticket to Guatemala and meeting some friends. I was going to go from Guatemala to Panama, ended up going Guatemala to Cuba to Australia. So completely different plan. Um, had a blast, came home. It's going to be productive. First day back, literally first day I got a new job. I went on my first date with the woman I am now married to. And she was like, "Hey, we should quit our jobs and ride our bikes from Alaska to Argentina." Like, okay, let's do it. So we didn't go that far. We only went Alaska to San Francisco. But then I went to grad school. And so I ended up getting my PhD in what what is now known as generative biology, which is kind of crazy. So I was doing some like variational autoencoders and cancer biology back before it was,
Mhm.
and I got into this, and we're gonna talk about like how do you get into AI kind of things. I got into it because I was curious about it, and a friend sent me a conference and said, "Hey, the abstract deadline for this conference is in 2 weeks. Trick is we don't have a project, so we got to do a project for the conference because the conference was in Madeira, Portugal, and we were like 100% we got to go to this conference." And so I just spent weeks like heads down writing my first neural net to train a variational autoencoder, and got accepted to the conference. Spent a week in Madeira drinking wine and eating seafood and talking about the science I had done for a total of 2 weeks. And that's how I got into AI. And then I've been doing it since. Um, and so I've done a series of AI related things in biotech, the AI in
Mm.
biotech. I've worked in government. I was the kind of founding head of biotech modernization at the Department of Defense. And then I started getting a reputation of people calling "Hey, we have got a crazy idea and we don't know anyone stupid enough to try. So we should call Titus." And so I started getting those kind of calls.
Mhm.
Um, and then right before this, I was at another job like that where I was at Colossal, the company trying to de-extinct the woolly mammoth because someone said, "Hey, this is crazy. Let's call all the people we know that are crazy." Um, and then when I first met them, I thought they were crazy, but eventually I was sold. And that's when Ava and I reconnected because originally we had connected because she was traveling, I had traveled, and then we worked at like kind of competing startups, and then
Mhm.
both ended up here. Where now today I'm an academic. I'm at USC, leading a research lab on like AI security and biology. Um, but it's been a wild ride. That's like there's a lot more in there, obviously. Not the part where I lived in a casino while I was applying to grad school, but that's in itself a whole story. I played blackjack for 5 months in the Motor City Casino in downtown Detroit while I was convincing PhD programs that I knew something about statistics.
Did you make any profits?
Oh yeah, I made a lot of money.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's how I convinced them that I knew anything about statistics. They were like, "Well, if you could gamble in a casino over the long term and make money, you know something about probability and kind of a commitment to a strategy." It's
Hmm.
really
I was always curious how you got into card playing specifically.
I lived in a casino and was bored.
um, Titus, I'm going to be honest. I was not expecting this answer. I do feel like there's a brewing Hollywood screenplay opportunity here. So I would want to dive I want to dive deeper into that a little bit. So it sounds like you cultivated like a wildly unusual multidisciplinary expertise from very different areas. I'm curious to hear, like, reflecting on your past decisions, where do you see your most impactful actions that allowed you to carve out this unique path? What's the inflection point?
So so there's two parts to that. One, the most impactful for me, and then the things that I've done that have had the most impact.
Hmm.
And for me, there was no, for the personal part, there was no inflection point. There was a systematic kind of distaste for how it's always done, the good old way or whatever.
Hmm.
And so I always said, well, why do we do it that way? And when no one could answer that question, I would say, all right, well, then I'm going to try to do it the way that makes sense for me, which came, similar to, my first job out of college at Box, I was in recruiting. It was great, but I was like, well, why do we reach out to candidates this way? And I had never even heard of the function of recruiting. And they were like, "Wow, it's just how recruiting's done." I was like, "Well, good thing I'm not a recruiter, so I'm going to do it my way." And it was wildly successful because I kind of systematized the way that I approached it. But then at 11 months in, if anyone in a startup knows that generally there's a 12-month cliff, 11 months in, I quit my job because I didn't know anything about cliffs and left without any equity. And, and so just like have continuously made a series of uh, decisions that are not just, so primary focus is what is the thing that's most interesting to me? And then if there is not that option, what is the thing that's going to make me harder to recruit some other time?
Hmm.
Meaning,
Hmm.
like, all right, it's either going to be impressive
Mm.
or fun, ideally both, but I prioritize fun over impressive. Um, until I went into consulting, and then I was like, all right, well, impressive is not very fun. So I've written so many slides that no one has ever seen. I'm gonna go to
Yeah.
I was only kind of joking when I say that I now have the reputation where people have an idea and they want someone who is willing to try, because if it hasn't been done before, there is no playbook. Right? You're the founder of a startup. There is no playbook for running the startup that you've built because no one's ever built it. Otherwise, no one would invest in it. And so I just have done that kind of in every aspect of my life. And because of that, the thing that I've done that I think so far has been the most impactful is leading this biotech modernization effort at the Department of Defense. The DoD
Hmm.
could, I say lovingly, could hardly spell DNA back in the day. And, and and now it's the vision of the CTO at the time said that biotech was going to be a kind of a top 10 tech priority.
Hmm.
And they needed someone to go try to figure out what the heck that meant. And when I was talking to them about the job, they said, well,
Hmm.
no one really believes in biology in the Pentagon. You don't have any staff, you don't have any money, and you don't have any authority. You want the job? And I was like, yes, that sounds
Sign me up.
yeah, exactly. Who's the one to do that? And so that's just how it's been kind of across the board. It sounds hard and sounds fun. There's a lot of ways to define fun. Oftentimes, I consider it type 2 fun, where it's fun when you
Hmm.
talk about it, but not necessarily fun while you do it. That's a lot of these experiences too.
Gotcha. And how did you end up in your academic post after a number of years in DoD?
So one of the other things I do is I am a commissioner on the National Security Commission for Emerging Biotech, and it's a kind of congressional advisory kind of commission. I serve in kind of my personal part-time capacity, and I was listening to a lot of input, particularly on AI and bio and that intersection, and people saying that there's concerns there about what might be possible, whether you could use it to generate more
Hmm.
virulent or more lethal or more antibiotic resistance or a whole bunch of other things. There are concerns from a security standpoint about what AI can do for biology. But I inherently think that's absolutely true, but there's not a ton of evidence to substantiate specifically what that means. Like, what are the specific risks and how do we deal with it? Because in this commission capacity, we're supposed to help write policy. And it's hard to write policy if you don't actually know specifically what you're trying to deal with. And so I thought that was a perfect opportunity to go put some work in and do some of the research that I really wanted to see done. So it's a very practical reason to go into academia, right? From very top down, like national policy needs this kind of data and this kind of research. So, all right, I'm going to go do that kind of research and then find other people who are doing interesting stuff. I mean, and that's how we're connected, because you're doing all this cool stuff with AI and bio, and there's a lot that the world can be doing when it comes to thinking about these models and how to implement them. And so I went to grad school because I originally wanted to be a professor. But they told me there was rules. You had to do 5 years of postdoc, then you had to get the right papers, then you had to go, and then you could get a faculty job. Maybe, most likely not. And so I didn't follow that path, and it worked out.
I'm gonna sidetrack for a second very quickly. I'm curious about one thing. So how, being, I guess you're very recent post in academia, but I'm curious what your sense has been for academia's take on biosecurity, because I recently, I think this was a few months ago, listened to a podcast or something from New York Times where they discussed two types of researchers. One who actually, was able to generate a sort of a potentially very hazardous virus, and then was able to actually publish that paper, and people around the scientific community around the world were quite upset that they were able to not only do it but publish methods that they've actually done that. So it was a biosecurity concern. And on the other hand, there was another researcher who done a similar thing, but then did publish it, but then did not release what the methods were. So it was not reproducible, but they were sort of more protective of the methods that ended up in creating those biohazardous viruses or whatever that might be. So I feel like there's not a consensus from the academia on how people should behave given the hazardous situations. What's your sense about it?
Yeah, I agree. There's not a consensus. There's not even a consensus in government necessarily, because the conversation is a lot of these models, for example. So if we're talking in the AI context, I think I know what you're talking about. Were you talking about the horsepox? Was that what
yeah, exactly. Yes.
That had nothing to do with AI. They just synthesized horsepox in a lab and then published it. And that's becoming more and more possible. And there's not a consensus of, right, if it's done out in the open, some argue if it's done out in the open, at least you know about it. And others argue it's an information security hazard that makes it easier for other people to do. And so, I could see both sides. I don't think it's as black and white as in all cases publish and in all cases don't publish. Because I think there's also some fundamental, it's just hard to do biology. Doesn't mean it's impossible. They probably used to say that about electrical engineering too. And now elementary schoolers have electrical engineering robots camps and stuff. So it is happening, but there's certainly not a consensus. And a lot of, I think 99.99, I'm making up the number, but 999% of academics who do things that people shake their heads at did it because they just didn't think about it. There was no malice involved. Right? It's like, look what happened. Look what happened. It's great.
Yep.
I was listening to a research presentation once. This is a story someone told me. And they get up to give their seminar, and the first thing they said is, well, we wiped the memory of the mice and then we did X, Y, and Z. And someone was like, what, can you go back to you did what to the mice? And of course you gotta do that, because you gotta start from a blank slate for learning and memory. And everyone's like, well, not everyone. The person was like, you could wipe a whole mouse's memory, and that's just the footnote of this slide. So it's not malice. Most there's value at the time, but there's also not a lot of, I was never trained in biosecurity as a grad school. My computer, I was a dry lab computer person, but it was in a biology lab, and so we did the good biosafety protocol and stuff. But No one ever said, this is how you think about information hazards.
Mm.
Not once.
So on a related
Yeah.
note, Titus, I saw your recent LinkedIn post on the Evo model that came out of the Arc Institute, right? That was trained on a huge repository of viruses. And you made a comment that said the most interesting thing about this, the paper that they put out, right, the white paper, was that it said they omitted viruses known to infect humans. I was wondering if you could expand on that comment a bit, and also, on whether that's a good strategy for sort of avoiding these models that could apparently evolve new pathogens.
Yeah, so for context for everyone, the Evo model is this massive hyena-based model architecture that was released by the Arc Institute and collaborators at Stanford. And so the reason it was notable is because it's an attempt to try to constrain models by not including training data that might be potentially harmful. So they used phage genomes, which are viruses that only infect bacteria. So that is an attempt. I have no idea whether that's a successful attempt or not. My first question, given this is what I think about now, is if I fine-tune that model on 10 harmful viral genomes, does it completely change the security that's built in? Who knows? But I think that's a great example of trying to take action towards keeping these models from being harmful. We just don't have enough bad attempts at preventing these models from being harmful to criticize anyone who's trying to take attempts there. And so I think it's a really good example of so part of this, to the question you were just asking, Burka, there's a part of the world who thinks that we should actually maybe omit some literature from the public domain, right? And there's a big kind of scientific ethos tension in those recommendations. But you could at least omit them from the training data, which is not omitting them from the world, it's omitting them from the training data. And so that's why I thought it was interesting, because I haven't seen, doesn't mean they haven't, but I haven't seen models where they explicitly said, for all the implicit reasons, we left out this whole swath. A lot of times people get criticized because someone forgot to include enough genomic diversity in the training data or something. But they explicitly said viruses that don't infect people, or some phrasing of that, which I was like, good on you. Be successful, but that's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, we'd love to shift gears a little bit, Titus, and ask you about your past and current work. I think the most pertinent question based on what was just said was, how did you originate the concept of violet teaming?
So important distinction. I did not originate the concept, and so I want to make sure it was a really interesting Wired article that was written in the context of ChatGPT 4. And so a researcher out of Harvard introduced the concept of violet teaming, but I thought it was really compelling because even in these modern science is far more integrated than it was before, but it's still pretty siloed. But in the policy hat that I'm wearing, I hear from a lot of different people talking about similar concerns and similar not concerns. So the things that concern them, keep them up at night or don't, overlap in a big Venn diagram. But these communities don't often talk to each other. And so the concept of violet teaming is that it's not just the eggheads, the AI eggheads like me in the conversation, and it's not just the pure biosecurity researcher whose only lens is how to reduce risk from biology, but it's also, what about the affected patients that would benefit from increased AI versus the kind of cost benefit analysis. And I'll give you a very tangible example of that. So people are worried that you might be able to engineer viruses that are more harmful. But if you just said we can't do viral engineering because of that concern, that's a very kind of red versus blue, black and white, red team versus blue team, black and white response to that risk. It's a technical response, like, cool, it's scary, let's not do it. But phage therapies are a huge category of growing therapeutics to treat antibiotic resistance or tumors and things like that. So what about all of the people who might survive because their antibiotic resistance infection was treated with a phage therapy and cured? And a phage is a virus. It's just a virus that specifically infects bacteria, like we talked about in the Evo model. So if you say we can't do viral engineering, then all of those people miss out on positive health benefits. And so it's not a black and white of viral engineering bad or viral engineering good. It's what's the context? Who are the stakeholders outside of, because like I, as a computational biologist, almost never talk to patients, right? It's just not, I'm not a clinical provider, so there's not a lot of patients if you don't do direct clinical research. So you don't have perspectives. So that's the idea behind this Violet teaming, is that there's a lot of people who care deeply on both sides of this conversation, and they're not opposing to the outcome. They're just disagreeing or seeing different sides of the coin for how to go about the solution. And so this idea of Violet teaming is, let's get more people in the room or more diverse perspectives to think about, all right, if we're worried about AI and biology in this context, let's have a group of people like, what if we could use AI to also help mitigate some of that? Can we have classifiers that look for sequences of concern in the process, right? It's just not a black and white. So maybe it's a violet concept. Although I just saw yesterday someone introduced the term rainbow teaming. So I was like, okay, that's gonna, next one is gonna be shades of gray teaming, and we're just gonna actually
sparkly glitter teaming. Yeah.
And I'm guilty of introducing one of these more and really leaning into it. So I'm not making fun of it. The title of the paper even had rainbow letters for the rainbow teaming title, so I was impressed.
Oh, cool. Well, thank you for that. I'd love to also look back. You've had such diverse roles, right? And we've covered now a little bit about your academic interests. But in the past, you've also held a security clearance for sensitive work with In-Q-Tel and also the Department of Defense, right? What, if anything, can you tell us about your work during these times?
I mean, I could tell you quite a bit about it, because really classified material tends to be things that are harmful if the information is out, but a lot of science is open. The application might be classified or something, but science is open even in the security community, a lot of it. And a lot of work that the DoD funds and the intelligence community funds is in academic labs, open source. A couple of things that my favorite things that I like to talk about that the DoD was working on, it wasn't necessarily me, but the reason that we really wanted a strategy was that one example was DARPA and the Air Force were working with a couple of companies to build growable runways. And so you actually take this microbial solution and spray it down on a dirt surface, and it produces this biocement, calcium carbonate. It's like a seashell material, and hardens the surface. So you can land helicopters and other small aircraft on it in places that there weren't runways. Like, who'd have thought we'd be growing runways?
That's insane.
Yeah.
Did not know that was possible.
And then, other projects, we're looking for, the scientists were looking for extremophiles and found, microbes that grew in fuel tanks that they were thinking were better for producing kind of sustainable fuel sources because they're already predisposed for that. There's lots of talk about dealing with our shortage and critical supply chain for rare earth metals by doing bioprospecting to find bugs that like to glom on to rare earth metals. So it makes it easier to extract from slurries like the seafloor, which is hard to mine right now. So a whole wide range of stuff. And like DARPA had been funding work in mRNA-based vaccines for a decade before the pandemic.
Right.
And so there were a lot of these kind of examples of excellence. And that's why eventually there was like, well, we should have a strategy for where we're going to go with this. And so that's the role I had, was what does that even mean to have a strategy for DoD biotech? And when I was at In-Q-Tel, the big project I worked on was so again, people love to say, you're dumb enough to try. You want to try this? So I went into In-Q-Tel, and they were like, someone left, and they left a project we'd like you to pick up. It's using homomorphic encryption to search databases. I was like, homo what? Is that a new species? Homo sapien and homomorphic evolution or something? And they were like, no, it's just a type of encryption that you don't have to decrypt it to do things. And I was like, well, sure, sounds hard. I'll try that. But it was cool because what we actually could do is you could think of it actually similar to like an encrypted blast. It was like a sequence comparison, sequence similarity score, but you took an encrypted piece of DNA, an encrypted piece of DNA, did your homology assessment, completely encrypted, and then you had a single number that you could then decrypt and say, oh, look, there's 80% similarity between these sequences. But the sequences never saw each other. The database didn't know what you were looking for. And the querier didn't actually know what was in the database. But you could still say something in that database has X% homology with the thing that I'm interested in. So it's kind of, you know, it's kind of one of those out there security applications that it was really slow at the time, but technology has changed a lot in the last however many years, 6, 7, 8 years. I mean, 6, 7, 8 months. So, so yeah, all kinds of cool stuff in there. And so I've been advising the security community since on they just can't keep up with how fast things are coming. So they'll be like, hey, do you know anyone doing this? Like, actually, I know 3 startups doing it. And so they love that, just being like, whoa, I didn't even know that was possible. Like, yeah. Neither did the startup founder until they got money to try.
Yeah, I saw I think a tweet the other day that said something like a long time in AI is 2 weeks, right? Like every 2 weeks we're just seeing, you know, new things drop and change the way we do things. So
well, for me,
yeah,
practically, I have to keep canceling my. Have to be like right now, Claude 3 drops, so I got to go start my Claude subscription again and drop my ChatGPT subscription, and then when ChatGPT 5 comes out, I got to drop Claude. Subscribe to. It's like this yo-yo.
It's a bit of a ping pong.
Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. So I think another area of involvement you've had that's super interesting is exemplified by your recent startup role, right, at Colossal, right? This idea of using AI and synthetic biology to actually fight climate change. I know you've also been involved in this elephant monitoring project as well for conservation purposes. And I was wondering, in that sort of realm of synthetic biology for fighting climate change, you know, what applications are you most excited about?
So many. So the same company that I was describing, one of my favorite examples is this company called Biomason, and they make bio-based bricks. And the thing about these bricks is they set at room temperature, so they don't require the same amount of energy and heat production as a traditional brick process, which I think is so the whole infrastructure could be upended when it comes to, in a good way, whatever you call it, disrupted. What's the startup term for that? Disrupted. These bio products. And then this bioprospecting for rare earth metals, I think, is really fascinating as well, because as another example, because mining is a particularly harmful or harsh experience on the environment. And so if you, instead of taking large petrochemical based machines down and digging up huge swaths of the earth, if you could actually use some kind of enzyme that is more designed to bind closer, has a higher affinity for these rare earth metals, you could theoretically reduce the environmental impact of mining in a lot of ways as well. And then so many materials are becoming more and more green when it comes to how they're produced. Another company that I have always been a fan of and worked with is a company called Checkerspot, that their first big product line was skis. I'm a big skier. And so of course the bio skis, I'm like always talking to people, yeah, these are basically kale chips. They make it, the engineer microalgae to do it. So it's a bad joke, and no one gets it on the ski. But they just announced that this same algae platform, they engineered to produce the OPO lipids that are in mother's milk fat that you could use to try to reduce the supply chain problems for infant formula. So you have this, you could produce food grade oils, performance grade polymers, all in one platform. And that's just one company who's doing, and there's lots of others too. So I go on and on, but there's so many applications in this space.
Yeah, I wonder if there's any other company that makes both skis and baby milk formula.
Yeah,
Seems
probably
unlikely.
not. Yeah, we should call up Kroger and say, hey, you want to, General Mills, you want to start producing mountain bikes?
Biomanufacturing.
Yeah.
It's a new age. Well, I'm curious, looking back at all of these projects, what projects are you most proud of so far?
Yeah, so I think it's all been the government related stuff because there's
Mm.
a lot of people in industry get access to the cutting edge a lot faster than
Hmm.
government. And so it's been really cool to be able to be that kind of translator of what's going on in industry into government because they're just different. They're like an impedance mismatch at times. And so this commission that I'm on is really cool, and the DoD stuff that I was working on is really cool. But I think that uh, across the board, there's my passion is actually really the people of science, and so
Mm.
it's less about one specific project because I'm honestly interested in anything that sounds hard and impossible to do. But it's when you help people have that aha moment. And so like when I started
Hmm.
my PhD gig, there were so many brilliant scientists in the federal research ecosystem is pretty large, and there were so many brilliant scientists who just weren't quite connecting with the like generals and policymakers in the Pentagon about like the so what, right? This is cool
Hmm.
science, but so what? And so
Mhm.
I always described my job there as bringing the green goo to the Zoom and Boom people. And that's that ethos is probably the most satisfying.
Hmm.
And people always ask me, like, do you like your job? I said, well, I like why I do my job. Because
Hmm.
also kind of a pain in the butt to work in government. And everyone who's worked there, I mean, people on the outside give government a bad reputation. It's full of people who just want the world to be a better place and for the people in our communities to be happy, healthy, taken care of, and they just are constrained by so many reasons. And
Hmm.
so helping break down that barrier as much as possible has been the most satisfying like activity throughout my career. And a number of projects, specific projects have come out of that, but that's by far
Hmm.
been the unifying theme of all this stuff. And 5 years ago it was all synthetic biology, and now it's all AI. And so the technology changes so fast that you just got to like ride that wave.
Oh, that's awesome. Speaking of change, the last year has completely changed the way that the world talks about AI, right? Especially generative AI. How do you see the opportunities and challenges of these new capabilities in the healthcare space?
I mean, like you said, 2 weeks is a lifetime in AI
Yeah.
space. The way that I heard someone talk about it, or I read a blog post by Mayfield in the
Hmm.
last week or so that talked about cognition as a service, as a new kind of business model, right? We had platform and infrastructure as a service, software as a service.
Hmm.
Now we're into cognition as a service. And I thought that
Hmm.
that was a great way to describe it because, I mean, that's what it is. When I work with ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini or whatever, right? I'm offloading the ifs, ands, and buts of life. And that lets me think. And so it might not be outsourced cognition, but it's elevated cognition on my end by outsourcing the things that don't take a lot of critical thinking, but take time and thinking to do. And I think in the healthcare space, we're going to see a lot of that where I'm really hopeful that it will improve patient experience. Um, if you and I can sit there and talk to each other, and you as my clinician can actually talk to me while the computer is taking notes and summarizing things,
Hmm.
flagging like, wait, you should ask more about this
Hmm.
because this doesn't fit with the medical history kind of thing. Like that's
Huh.
imminent. Probably in the next 12 to 24 months, that kind of thing is possible. If not,
Interesting.
and just think about the like human experience. I have a bunch of people working on directed research with me, and one of the students is working on how do we think about AI as a facilitator of talk therapy? Like, is
Hmm.
there empathy there? Um, and so he and I were brainstorming the other day. what is the EQ of AI, right? Everyone's talking about AI having like artificial general intelligence, often thought of more in like the IQ version, but what is the actual emotional intelligence of these things? This is really a good example of this is if people were following all of the drama around Gemini generating pictures of like different fathers. But if Gemini as a model had high EQ, it would know if you're asking about a leader in the United States of America circa 1700, it's likely only a white man, right? In the colonies. And so there's some emotional intelligence to think of, and that you could call that kind of contextual. I also think of it as kind of conditional intelligence, if you think about. But there's going to be a lot of those that are going to improve the way we do science, live life, deal with healthcare.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to ask a little more about the Gemini controversy because, to my understanding, there's sort of a part of Twitter that is sometimes unsavory, and I try not to go on too much, right? But where people were in fact very mad about, misassigning ethnicity to historical figures, right? And the Google team may have known this was a possible error, but they attempted to train the model in an unbiased manner. But if you were to do that, right, you would get probably disproportionate ethnicities. For example, like most pictures of people walking their dog on the internet are probably Caucasian, even though that's not representative of a lot of different countries, right? So it seems like they tried to red team themselves and then had all these sort of unexpected consequences. How do you think about like red teaming in a more intelligent way that captures this EQ?
Well, I actually think that's where you start to have this violet teaming concept because and I don't know anything about their internal processes. So I'm just speaking generally, but largely engineers tend to be white and male, right? People like me. And so it's again not out of malice. It's just like they might have said, yeah, we're shifting that, but that context just might not have been the kind of thing you think about if you're not the kind of person that has been misrepresented or your ancestors have been misrepresented historically, things like that. So having people who are the end parties who have other perspectives of how AI impacts, I think that's the whole idea of it's not just red teaming because let's just inject as much diversity into the generative pictures as possible. Clearly, diversity is not always better when you want historically accurate things to represent times where diversity was oppressed, right? And so it's not a black and white, and I don't mean that racially, I mean that shades of gray in context. It's not an easy answer. And so I also think, I'm on the side of, right, I'm a white male in this conversation. So largely, I don't feel like I should have an opinion on this just because, I could say, they did their best, but that might not be good enough and say, all right, well, we should definitely be mad at them. But, I just think that we need more representation in the process of red teaming and blue teaming and these things, because these things that we would largely call, attribute technically to edge cases are often the most important because those are edge cases that mean something either positively or negatively that you can't just statistically average over when you have one model that does everything. And so that's the example where you could have another model that checks it and says, are people from, our founding fathers from the 1700s anything other than white men? No. So we can do image processing to say, this is not an accurate image. But it's hard because if people can generate anything. So this is why,
and that bias can get even more harmful and critical in healthcare, right? So I think there's this technological idea where just as the model can learn a bias in the data sets, probably some research should go into how to unlearn that bias instead of retroactively trying to prompt a model or sort of feed in like a fine tuning and information to change the ethnicity of an image. So I think there's still some, as well as violet teaming or red teaming it, some technological research that needs to go into unlearning that bias and making sure that downstream effects are sort of thoroughly researched before it's actually productionized, especially in the healthcare area, right?
Yeah, totally. And I think a lot of people anchor on trying to have these like huge 200 billion parameter, whatever that means to people, one model. And they talk about it in the context of a model. But these systems are so complex, and the socio-technical environment we live in is so complex that I think that we're going to need to go to more systems types of approach, right? One model might not be the model that does everything, but an orchestration of a system of models designed to try to do the right thing, that might be the route we have to go. Because you could still have one model that does most of the just general tasks in life, but you have more expert systems, right, that orchestrate and keep things in line. And that's how I actually think from a science standpoint, AI is going to be more of like a orchestrator of expert systems rather than one model to know everything about biology, chemistry, physics.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think to scale up the adoption of artificial intelligence, we should definitely scale down and combine into systems. That's what large language models are capable of, right? There are cases that large language models cannot even make simple arithmetics, what that Wolfram Alpha or a simple calculator can do. So on top of that, most of the time, these really huge models are prohibitively expensive. And I think there's another area of research and technology that needs significant advancements before we can think about large language models where we can go ahead and say, hey, can you um, you know design this X virus for me for Y disease in sort of vaccine form, and it does it because of its all huge knowledge. But just like you said, probably having systems and a collection of AI models that are scaled down to do one thing really, really well instead of all different tasks, generally kind of okay, is a better way to go in enhancing our current processes.
Yeah, and to that point about the prohibitively expensive, I think it was ByteDance that just came out with a paper that was like, this was trained on 12,000 GPUs. I called a friend and I was like, what am I doing here? Like, I don't even have 12 GPUs. Like, come on. But the thing where I think academic AI is really going to be important is the science, what you're just talking about, the science and rigor behind this. Sure, you can train a huge model, but do we actually know what it's doing? Do we actually know how to benchmark it? Do we know how to put guardrails on? The things around it are still very unexplored. And people writing papers all the time about how we actually don't know how these models work at all. Right? They do things, but we don't know why.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I read a article recently where someone was attributing it back to before we understood quantum physics, how we didn't understand how most the fundamentals of the world worked, but we knew it did it. We just didn't know why. So maybe there's a quantum analogy. Maybe it is quantum. Who knows? Like AI quantum entanglement, and it goes to control the design of a virus. I think you talk about a lot of buzzwords all in one.
Right.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that, Titus. I think looking towards the future, what advice would you give aspiring researchers hoping to make waves in the AI and biospace?
Don't try to be an expert at everything. Get really good at learning really fast. I had a professor in college, went to a liberal arts school, and my freshman seminar was the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, as one does.
Of course.
Yeah. And he said, he opened up the class with, college doesn't teach anything. And we're all looking around like, I just got a call from my parents about my tuition check. Like, what? It does teach you one thing, and it teaches you how to learn anything in a long weekend. And at the time, it's like, okay, well, it's weekend. I'm going to go do something else and not think about this. But now I think like that's all I do is learn things in long weekends or in between things. Like AI is changing so fast that
Mm.
just being good at reading and interpreting and thinking critically about those things are important.
Mm.
I think on the computational scientist side, there is a bias right now towards AI, and so everyone is starting to shift that way, but it doesn't take away the need for, rigorous bioinformatics. These expert systems are still better than AI at the moment. And so understanding how to implement them in parallel, in conjunction, is going to be really big. And then I think that for people who are scientists who are not computational scientists, but want to use AI in all their tools, all their research, you got to think about, like, I mean, this is one of the reasons that I love Superbio and why I was drawn to talk to you guys, because your ability to implement and use some of these tools, even if you didn't know how to build them, train them, fine tune them, you could still like get all the benefit without knowing that you need a certain type of loss function, a certain number of epochs before your L2 classification error is wrong. Like, that doesn't mean anything to biology, but your ability to implement an LLM or a biological design tool for your research is here and now even more. And so just do more of that, but don't put all your science eggs in that basket. That's my big one right now, is validate, because things hallucinate and going to change. You learn one tool and it's going to be a different tool tomorrow. So yeah, it's hard. It's wonderful. At this point, I just like hope to sit in my little science raft on top of the water and like paddle with the paper at a time, be like, oh, this is cool. But I don't even, there's no way to try to keep up at all.
Awesome. Well, we might skip to the end, Titus, in the interest of time, but we have a signature question here at Superbio. And the question is, the year is 2222. What did AI do to our lives? Are we living forever, or is it a 1984-esque world where people are living under one big evil corp?
So I'm an eternal optimist. So I'm more just predisposed to the AI has fundamentally improved the quality of human life and plant and animal and environmental experience if we develop it, if we do it on purpose. And that's how I spend a lot of my time, is if we just do it without thinking about it, then there's lots of ways for things to go awry. But I think that, I mean, ChatGPT came onto the market 15 months ago. So projecting out 100+ years is like,
Totally.
I have no idea, but I do think it's going to improve everything for the better. I think that I think our lives are going to be objectively just healthier, but I think that there is real risk for dramatically exacerbated inequality if we don't do it right. Right? Because even there was a study that came out even a couple months ago that said just knowledge workers who use AI versus don't see a marked shift in their productivity, whatever it means. And so that's now. So we just want to make sure that everyone has access to these tools. And it's not just the people who can pay $20 a month for a subscription to ChatGPT.
It is sort of similar to changing from faxes to computers. It kind of feels like, in a more advanced, as a business, as a worker in the workforce, you would probably need to do it, as even you can push it away as much as possible, or as long as possible. But I think, just like you said, maybe the tech providers or the governments, they should be the ones that maybe provide enough access to these tools to make sure that no one is really left behind, and we don't exacerbate the already existing discrepancies in access to knowledge.
Yeah, well, and I mean, it originally was computers were super expensive and cell phones were prohibitive, but now, I mean, a huge majority of the world has an Android phone at a minimum, and also an technology cost goes down. We just got to do it in a way that it doesn't just, create this divide that makes it so people can never catch up.
Yeah. Right. What's next for you, Titus, in life?
I have no idea. I'm living in New York for a couple months, right now. I live my life like three months at a time. So I'm basically a digital nomad. So I know about as much as where I'm going to be. I do know where I'm going to be living in June. So that's about as far out as I have.
Okay.
planned.
Okay.
Um,
Sounds good.
but I know that I'm going to be working on these problems. Like, another thing I'm super interested in is quantum biology. So I could see a version of the world where I become a quantum biologist after AI gets too crowded. Oh, so you talk about one of these really cool projects. Okay, one last story. There's a super cool project that was being funded in the UK by one of the DoD groups at a university to study the proteins in birds' eyes that help align to the magnetic lines on the Earth. Like,
Whoa.
yeah, so like animals navigate based on the magnetic, like the quantum whatever, I don't know the technical terms, but basically quantum proteins in their eyes and brains and bodies know where the Earth's magnetic poles are and can navigate that way. So studying that for all kinds of crazy things, it's just like, so it might be quantum biology. Maybe that's my answer.
I can see where your
Super
mind
cool.
is going, definitely. We can probably talk for hours and learn about all the crazy things you've done. But as Eva said just for the time being, thank you so much for joining the Super Bioscientist Spotlight, Titus.
Yeah.
It's been a pleasure to have you.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.